Welcome, travelers, to the court of Valhallow. I am so glad you found your way here. If you are loving the chaotic chemistry between our accidental queen and her possessive king, do me a favor, press that like button. It tells the algorithm that you crave more intoxicating stories like this one. And if you want to be notified the moment our next romance drops, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. You don't want to be left in the dark when the heat rises. Finally, I am dying to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Are you safe in your bed, driving through the city, or hiding in a break room? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I love seeing how far our pack extends across the map. Now, let's get back to the king. I woke up naked in the bed of the Butcher King with a hangover from hell and no memory of the night before. Then I saw it, a fresh, glowing soul rune tattooed right over his pulse point, my handwriting, his neck. I tried to run, but an invisible leash yanked me back against his hard chest. He didn't kill me, he didn't even yell, he just leaned down, inhaled my scent, and whispered the most terrifying words I've ever heard. "You marked the beast, little scribe. Now you have to live in the cage." The first thing Vespera noticed was the smell. It didn't smell like her cramped studio apartment above the meatpacking district, which usually reeked of stale ale, magical ink solvents, and bad life choices. This smell was expensive. It assaulted her senses with notes of sandalwood, cold steel, rain-soaked earth, and a raw, masculine musk that made her toes curl instinctively. The second thing she noticed was that the pillow she was drooling on was disturbingly hard, and warm, and breathing. Vespera cracked one eye open. The morning sun of Valhallow filtered through massive, floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains, blinding her, but not enough to miss the landscape of muscles currently serving as her mattress. She was draped like a wet towel across a chest so wide it defied the laws of physics. It was scarred with silvery slash marks, panned a deep bronze, and terrifyingly solid. Oh no, Vespera thought, the hangover hitting her like a sledgehammer to the frontal lobe. Her mouth tasted like Moon-Mead and copper. Where am I? Who is this? And why am I naked? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the alcohol haze. She tried to slide off the bed, inch by inch, holding her breath. She made it to the edge of the mattress, her foot seeking the floor, when the memories of the previous night began to flicker in her mind like a broken projector. The Festival of Shadows, a dare from her friends, breaking into the royal wing, a bottle of the king's private reserve, and a very large, very angry man who suddenly stopped being angry when she offered to fix him. She froze. Her gaze drifted up the mountain of man she had slept on. Staring down at her, though his eyes were currently closed, was King Malakai Vane, the Butcher of Oakhaven, the Lycan king who had reportedly eaten the last rebellion leaders for breakfast without salt. He was awake. His breathing had shifted, and he was waiting. Vespera's eyes widened in horror. She scrambled backward, tangling herself in black silk sheets that cost more than her entire education. She finally looked at his neck. She was a Rune-Scribe, a magical artist who could etch spells into skin. It was a rare, dangerous talent. And last night, in her drunken stupor, she had practiced her craft. There, right over the king's jugular, where his lethal pulse hammered against the skin, was a fresh, angry, still healing tattoo. It wasn't just a doodle. It was a glowing blue rune of binding, ancient, forbidden soul magic, and underneath the rune in her distinctive, slightly sloppy handwriting, she had inked a sentence into the flesh of the most dangerous predator on the continent. If found, return to Vespera. Vespera stared at the ink. The magical residue was still shimmering, binding the spell to his life force. "Oh gods," she whispered, her voice a dry squeak. The mountain moved. One heavy, iron-like arm shot out, clamping around her waist with the speed of a striking cobra. He hauled her back against his chest with zero effort, pinning her legs with his massive thigh. "Leaving so soon, little scribe." His voice rumbled through his chest and vibrated directly into her spine. It sounded like gravel grinding in a blender, deep, dangerous, and utterly terrifying. Vesperis froze, her face inches from his. Malakai opened his eyes. They weren't just wolf eyes. They were molten gold, burning with a predatory intelligence that stripped her bare. There was no sleep in them. He had been awake for a long time. He tilted his head, exposing the fresh tattoo to the light. The skin around it was red and irritated, but the magic hummed with a low thrumming beat that matched her own heart. "You have excellent penmanship," Malakai drawled, his lips curling into a dark, terrifying smirk. "But usually, when one claims property in Valhalla, they sign a contract. They don't carve their name into the king's throat."
Chapter 2. The Walk of Shame. Denied. "I can explain," Vespera squeaked, clutching the silk sheet to her chest as if the flimsy fabric could protect her from a 7-foot-tall Lycan warlord. The air in the room was thick with tension, smelling of ozone and magic. Malakai propped himself up on one elbow, the movement rippling through his back muscles like water over stones. He didn't look like a man who wanted to execute her. He looked like a wolf who had just caught a very interesting, very chaotic rabbit and was debating which part to eat first. He reached up, his large, calloused hand brushing over the fresh ink on his neck. He winced slightly, not from pain, but from the sensation. "You branded me," he stated. His tone was deceptively calm, devoid of the famous rage that had earned him the title, the Butcher. "You broke into the royal suite, bypassed the blood wards, drank 3 bottles of my 50-year-old Moon-Mead, pinned me to this mattress, and tattooed a high-level possession rune on my throat." "Pinned you?" Vespera blinked, her indignation momentarily overriding her survival instinct. "Your Majesty, look at you. You're the size of a siege tower. I'm 5 foot nothing, and I have the upper body strength of a damp noodle. I didn't pin you. You cooperated." Malakai paused. A dark, sinful glint entered his golden eyes. "I was curious," he admitted, his voice dropping an octave. "You were very persuasive. You climbed into my lap and told me my soul looked wobbly, and you wanted to make me pretty." Vespera buried her face in her hands, groaning into her palms. "I am going to be beheaded. Publicly. My mother is going to be so disappointed." "Usually, yes," Malakai agreed, sitting up fully. The sheet fell to his waist, revealing a torso scarred by centuries of war, claw marks, burn scars, and the jagged line of a blade that had clearly missed his heart by an inch. Treason is a capital offense. Assaulting the king is immediate death. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. Vespera squeezed her eyes shut, but not before catching a glimpse of everything. He was magnificent and terrifying. He walked toward her, blocking out the sun. "But there is a problem, Vespera," he said, looming over her. "The rune. Do you know what ink you used?" Vespera peeked through her fingers. My special blend, dragon ash and..." "Oh no." She paled. "I used the soul anchor vial, didn't I?" "You did," Malakai confirmed. "It binds the artist to the canvas. Permanently." He leaned down, placing his hands on the mattress on either side of her hips, trapping her. He inhaled deeply near her neck, and Vespera felt a jolt of electricity zip straight from her nose to her core, causing her to gasp. "If you leave this room," Malakai whispered against her ear, the heat of his breath making her shiver, "I feel physical pain. It starts as a migraine. Then it feels like my blood is boiling. If you get past the castle gates, the severance of the bond will drive my wolf feral. I will hunt you down and tear the city apart to find you." He pulled back, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look into his burning eyes. "So congratulations, little scribe. You didn't just tattoo me, you accidentally married me." Vespera stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Married? That's archaic. I can scrub it off. I have solvents." "It's soul magic," Malakai growled, a low vibration that shook the bedframe. "It doesn't wash off. You claimed the king, Vespera, and the king does not let go of what belongs to him."
Chapter 3. The Escape Artist. Vespera Valerius was many things: a chaotic drunk, a brilliant artist, and a disappointment to her noble parents, but she was not a quitter. She was also a rogue Rune-Scribe, which meant she knew loopholes in magic better than anyone. "He thinks he can keep me as a pet because of some accidental ink?" she thought furiously. "I don't think so." She waited for the inevitable. Malakai, seemingly unbothered by his new marital status, walked into the massive ensuite bathroom, the heavy door clicking shut. The shower turned on, the sound of water filling the silence. "Now," Vespera whispered. She sprang into action. She ignored her silk dress, which was torn and hanging from the chandelier. She grabbed a velvet robe from his wardrobe, wrapped it tight, and snatched her boots from the floor. From the heel of her left boot, she pulled out her emergency stylus, a small silver needle infused with quartz. "Sorry, Your Majesty," she muttered, hiking up the robe. She pressed the needle to her own thigh and began to scratch. It stung, but she worked fast, drawing the jagged, airy symbol of featherfall mixed with shadow step. It was crude magic, rushed and sloppy, but it would work. She ran to the balcony. The drop was terrifying, 300 feet straight down into the royal gardens. The Spire of Bone was the highest point in Valhalla. The wind whipped her hair, smelling of smog and magic. 1, 2, 3. Vespera jumped. The magic on her thigh flared hot. Instead of plummeting to her death, gravity softened its grip. She floated down like a dandelion seed, the wind catching the velvet robe and billowing it out like wings. "Ha!" she laughed, the adrenaline spiking. "Take that, you overgrown puppy." She landed softly in a bed of prize-winning hydrangeas. She scrambled to her feet, dirt smudging her face. Freedom. "I just need to get to the lower city, change my name to Mildred, and become a goat farmer in the Badlands." She took 10 running steps toward the garden gates. Suddenly, her chest tightened. It wasn't pain. It was pressure, like a fish hook snagging her navel. She gasped, stumbling. The pressure turned into a yank. A golden, shimmering leash of magic manifested in the air, connecting her chest to the high balcony above. "Oh, come on," she yelled at the sky. High above, King Malakai stepped onto the balcony. He had a towel wrapped around his waist, water dripping from his dark hair. He looked down at the tiny figure in his garden. He didn't look angry. He crossed his massive arms over his chest and tilted his head. "Fetch," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the magic carried it right to her ear. The rune on his neck flared blue, bright enough to outshine the sun. Vespera screamed as the invisible force yanked her backward. She didn't float this time, she dragged. Her heels dug furrows into the manicured lawn as the magic hauled her back toward the tower. "No! No! No!" She clawed at the grass, grabbing a rosebush, but the thorns tore through her grip. The magic lifted her into the air, hauling her up the side of the stone tower like a relentless elevator, bypassing gravity entirely. She flailed, cursing in 3 dead languages until she was deposited unceremoniously onto the cold stone of the balcony floor, right at his bare feet. Vespera coughed, spitting out a rose petal she had inhaled. She looked up. Malakai loomed over her, blocking out the sun. He looked incredibly amused. This is kidnapping, she wheezed, glaring at his toes. This is marital bliss, Malakai corrected. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The scent of him, clean soap and aggressive alpha power was overwhelming. You marked me, Scribe. In my culture, that is a claim. You staked your territory. Now you have to live in it.
Chapter 4. The Public Declaration. Malakai didn't let her dress herself in her ruined clothes. He summoned a terrifying phalanx of stone-faced servants who marched into the suite with efficiency that suggested they dealt with the king's naked conquests often, but their eyes widened when they saw the glowing mark on his neck. They scrubbed Vespera until she was pink, oiled her skin with scented balms that smelled of jasmine and gold, and dressed her in layers of midnight blue silk and silver chains. It was the attire of a high queen. I look like a sacrificial lamb, Vespera muttered, staring at herself in the mirror. The silver chains clinked softly as she moved. You look like mine, Malakai rumbled from the doorway. He was dressed now, in black leather armor with the royal crest, a wolf devouring a sun, emblazoned on the chest. He looked lethal. He marched her out of the suite and down the grand staircase. Vespera tried to drag her feet, but Malakai's hand engulfed hers, his grip unyielding. The halls of the obsidian palace were cold and sharp, much like their owner. Where are we going? Vespera hissed as they approached the massive double doors of the throne room. To prevent your murder, Malakai said simply. My guards smelled you on me. They smell the binding magic. They think you have bewitched me. If I do not present you, they will assassinate you before lunch. Before Vespera could process that horrific information, the doors banged open. The court of Valhalla was a nightmare. It wasn't just wolves. It was a pit of vipers. Shifters, vampires, and dark fae stood in clusters, draped in velvet and jewels, their eyes sharp and hungry. When Malakai entered, the room went dead silent. He dragged Vespera to the dais. She stumbled, trying to keep up with his long strides, feeling hundreds of predator eyes tracking her jugular. My lords, Malakai boomed. His voice didn't need to be loud. It carried the weight of absolute authority. It shook the stained glass windows. He turned his head to the side, deliberately exposing the fresh tattoo on his neck. The court gasped. A collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the room. A possession mark on a king? It was treason. It was blasphemy. It was impossible. Who dared touch you, sire? The voice was like oil slicking over water. Lord Kalen, a vampire with pale skin and a smile that had too many teeth, stepped forward from the shadows. His eyes locked onto Vespera with hungry malice. This mortal creature, Kalen sneered. She has defiled the royal vessel. Give her to me, my king. I will flay the skin from her bones and return your dignity. Vespera instinctively tried to hide behind Malakai's massive back, clutching his cape. Here it comes, she thought, her heart stopping. This is where he hands me over. Malakai looked at Lord Kalen. Then he felt the small, trembling hands clutching his back. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of the butcher. Touch her, Kalen, Malakai said softly, the silence in the room magnifying his words. And I will burn your lineage to ash. I will turn your estate into a graveyard and use your skull as a wine cup. He reached behind him, pulled Vespera out, and slammed her up against his side. His arm wrapped around her waist like an iron band, pulling her feet off the ground so she was pressed flush against his hard body. This is not a criminal, Malakai announced, his golden eyes sweeping a room, daring anyone to challenge him. This is my mate. She has marked me. She has claimed me. And if anyone looks at her with anything less than reverence, I'll let her tattoo idiot on your foreheads before I rip your throats out. Chapter 5. The Spire of Bone. The Spire of Bone sounded ominous, like a place where heroes went to die. In reality, It was worse. It was Malakai's private penthouse at the very top of the highest tower in Valhalla, accessible only by a magical lift that required a drop of royal blood. It was a masterpiece of masculine luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the smoggy, neon-lit magical city below. The floors were black marble, covered in white fur rugs that looked suspiciously like polar bear. There were no doors, only arches, creating a vast, open space of shadows and opulence. Vespera stood in the center of the room, still shaking from the throne room encounter. Malakai was prowling the perimeter, checking the wards. She walked to the only bedroom area. It was dominated by a bed the size of a small island, covered in furs and black silk. "There is one bed," Vespera noted, her voice flat. "I noticed," Malakai said, walking past her to a crystal decanter. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. "Great, I'll take the couch." Vespera pointed to a sleek, leather sofa that looked about as comfortable as a rock. "I don't share," Malakai said, downing his drink in one swallow. "Exactly. You take the bed, I take the—" "I meant I don't share my mate," Malakai corrected, turning to face her. His eyes were dark, swirling with something heavy and intense. "You sleep where I sleep. The rune demands proximity. If you are more than 10 feet away, the headache starts." He walked toward her. Vespera backed up, her heels clicking on the marble, until her shoulders hit the cold stone wall. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, placing his hands on the wall on either side of her head, trapping her in a cage of muscle and heat. "Why?" Vespera whispered, breathless. "Why are you going along with this? You're the king. You could call a high wizard. You could cut the skin off. Why keep me?" "I tried cutting it," Malakai admitted, his voice rough. "This morning, before you woke up, I took a dagger to it." Vespera gasped. "It healed instantly," he said. "It's soul magic, Vespera. Dangerous, ancient stuff. You anchored yourself to my beast." He leaned down, his nose brushing the curve of her neck, inhaling deeply. Vespera froze, her heart thumping wildly. "Besides," Malakai murmured, his lips grazing her pulse point, "for 200 years, my wolf has been silent, bored, angry. He hates everyone. He hates me." He took her hand, his grip callous and warm, and brought it up to his neck. He pressed her palm flat against the fresh tattoo. The skin was hot, pulse-pounding hot. Under her hand, she felt a vibration, a low, rhythmic rumble that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. "Can you feel that?" he rasped, his eyes burning into hers. Are you growling?" "No," Malakai said, a look of genuine confusion and wonder crossing his scarred face. "Since you put this ink here, my wolf hasn't stopped purring. You broke something in me, Scribe. You quieted the rage." He leaned in closer, his large body pressing her against the wall. The heat radiating off him made her dizzy. "And until I figure out what you did, you aren't going anywhere." He reached for the silver clasp of her heavy ceremonial cloak. "Now, take off this ridiculous dress. It's time for bed."
Chapter 6. The Erasure Attempt. The bed command had turned out to be literal. Malakai Vane, the terrifying tyrant of Valhalla, had simply stripped down to his boxers, hauled Vespera into the center of the massive mattress, wrapped his limbs around her like a possessive octopus, and fallen asleep instantly. Now, 3 hours later, the room was bathed in moonlight. Vespera lay pinned beneath the king's heavy arm, her heart racing. "This is my chance," she thought. "If I can erase the rune, the bond breaks. He wakes up, realizes he hates me, and I go back to my studio apartment." She wiggled her right arm free. Being a Rune-Scribe meant she always carried tools, even in a silk nightgown. She had secreted a small vial of null ink, a rare solvent used to correct mistakes, into the hem of her sleeve before the bath. She uncorked the vial with her teeth. The smell of ozone and lemons filled the small air pocket between them. Holding her breath, Vespera reached out. Malakai was deep asleep, his breathing slow and rhythmic, the purring vibration in his chest vibrating against her ribs. She hovered her finger, dipped in null ink, over the glowing blue tattoo on his neck. "Just a little scrub," she whispered, "and we're divorced." She touched the ink to the rune. Instead of dissolving, the rune drank the solvent. A flash of white light blinded her. Malakai's eyes snapped open. They weren't golden, they were entirely black. Vespera yelped, trying to pull her hand back, but the magic had created a bridge. The sensation wasn't pain, it was overload. A shockwave of pure, unfiltered sensation slammed into her. She felt what he felt, the scratch of the ink, the heat of her skin, and a sudden roaring wave of pleasure that curled her toes. Malakai growled, a sound that started deep in his chest and ended in a shudder. He grabbed her wrist, pressing her ink-stained finger harder against his neck. "What are you doing, witch?" he rasped, his voice thick and heavy. "Trying to erase it," she gasped, her body arching involuntarily as the feedback loop intensified. "It's supposed to dissolve." "It's feeding," he groaned, his hips snapping forward, pinning her flush against him. "You're feeding energy directly into a soul bond. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" He looked at her, his expression tight with restrained ecstasy. The rune was pulsing violently now, turning the magical solvent into pure adrenaline and arousal. "It feels like lightning," he whispered. He flipped her over, pinning her beneath him. The null ink on her fingers smeared across his throat as he buried his face in her neck, inhaling sharply. The magic crackled between them, snapping like static electricity. "Don't," he commanded, biting gently on the sensitive cord of her neck. "Don't try to remove it. You'll burn us both down." Vespera lay there, panting as the king of Valhalla shook with the effort of not ravaging her right then and there. She realized two things. First, her magic was clearly broken, and second, erasing this tattoo was going to be a lot harder than she thought, mainly because the canvas was enjoying it too much. Chapter 7. Dinner with the Wolves. The next evening, Malakai decided that hiding his new mate in the tower was insufficient. He wanted to parade her. Dinner was held in the Great Hall, a cavernous room filled with the high lords and ladies of the court. These were not nice people. They were ancient vampires, shifting warlords, and fae who would steal your firstborn for a laugh. Vespera sat at the head of the table, to the right of Malakai's massive black iron throne. She was wearing a gown of emerald velvet that was cut dangerously low, displaying the silver collar Malakai had gifted her, locked on, an hour ago. "So," Lady Nyx, a shadow fae with eyes like voids, drawled from across the table. She picked at her raw steak. "This is the scribbler, the one who defaced the crown." The table went silent. Insulting the king's property was usually a death sentence, but the court was testing the waters. They wanted to see if Malakai had gone soft. Vespera picked up her goblet of wine. She was terrified, but she was a girl from the lower city. She didn't do demure. "I prefer embellished," Vespera corrected, taking a sip. "The king's neck was looking a little empty. I thought it needed some character." "Unlike your conversation, Lady Nyx." A collective gasp swept the table. Malakai, who was in the middle of cutting his meat, froze. Lady Nyx stood up, shadows curling around her fingers like smoke. "You dare speak to me, mortal? I am 300 years old. I could crush your mind with a thought." "And yet," Vespera shrugged, grabbing a bread roll, "you're wearing a dress from 3 seasons ago. So clearly the mind isn't working that hard." It was a petty, stupid insult. It was suicidal. Nyx's eyes flared purple. She raised a hand to strike Vespera down with magic. A knife slammed into the table. It buried itself 3 inches deep into the solid oak, vibrating with force. It was Malakai's steak knife. The king wasn't looking at Nyx. He was looking at Vespera, and his shoulders were shaking. A low, rumbling sound filled the hall. It took Vespera a moment to realize what it was. Laughter. The Butcher of Oakhaven threw his head back and laughed. It was a rusty, terrifying sound, like a dungeon gate opening for the first time in centuries. "She has teeth," Malakai grinned, looking at his horrified court with savage delight. "I like it." He turned his glowing eyes to Lady Nyx. "Sit down, Nyx. If you touch her, I'll feed you to the hounds, and buy yourself a new dress. My mate thinks you look tacky." Vespera blinked, holding her bread roll. She looked at the terrifying king who was currently looking at her like she was the most entertaining thing he had seen in a millennium. Oh no, she thought. He likes the chaos. Chapter 8. The Fever. The truce lasted exactly 12 hours. By the next afternoon, Vespera felt like she was standing inside a furnace. She was in the library, trying to research soul runes without Malakai hovering over her. He was currently in a war council meeting down the hall. Suddenly, a wave of heat hit her. It wasn't the temperature of the room, it was internal. It started in her chest, right where the invisible tether connected her to Malakai, and spread downward, settling heavily in her stomach and between her thighs. "Is it hot in here?" Vespera gasped, tugging at the collar of her dress. Her skin felt sensitive, too tight for her body. The smell of old books, usually comforting, was suddenly overwhelming. Everything smelled too sharp. Then a new scent hit her. It rolled through the heavy oak doors of the library like a physical wave. Sandalwood. Rain. Aggression. Malakai. The doors banged open. Malakai stood there. He looked unhinged. His tie was gone, his shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, and his eyes were blown wide, the pupils swallowing the gold. He was panting. "What is this?" he growled, stalking toward her. "What are you doing to me?" "I'm reading. I didn't do anything." "Liar," he snarled. He crossed the room in 2 strides, slamming his hands against the shelves on either side of her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling desperately. "I was in the middle of a treaty negotiation. Suddenly, I couldn't think, I couldn't speak. All I could smell was you. All I could feel was this ache." He pressed his hips against hers. He was hard, painfully hard. Vespera whimpered, the sound involuntarily escaping her throat. The sound seemed to snap something in Malakai. The rune on his neck flared so bright it shone through his skin. "It's the bond," Vespera realized, her mind foggy with lust that wasn't entirely hers. "The ink. It's reacting to biology. It's a heat flare." "I don't care what it is," Malakai rasped, his teeth grazing her earlobe. "Fix it. You started this fire, Scribe. Put it out." He lifted her up, pressing her against the books. Vespera wrapped her legs around his waist instinctively, seeking friction. The logic part of her brain was screaming danger, but the rest of her was screaming yes. "Malakai, we can't. The library. The guards." "Let them watch," he growled, biting down on her shoulder, claiming her. "Let them see that the king burns for his scribe." Chapter 9. The Bargain of the Beast. They didn't desecrate the library, mostly because Vespera managed to cast a sleep rune on Malakai right before he ripped her dress open. It bought her 5 minutes to run away and lock herself in the bathroom of the Spire. Now it was night. The heat flare had subsided to a dull throb, managed by cold showers and separation. Malakai sat on the edge of the massive bed, looking sane again, though his jaw was tight. "We need rules," Vespera said, peeking out from the bathroom door. She was wielding a toilet brush like a sword. "Put down the brush, Vespera," Malakai sighed, rubbing his temples. "I am not going to ravage you. The flare has passed." Vespera stepped out cautiously. That wasn't normal. You turned into a werewolf, a very horny werewolf. I am a werewolf, Malakai pointed out dryly, and that was the rune amplifying my instincts. It demands consummation. The longer we deny it, the more volatile I become. He patted the spot beside him on the bed. Come here. Sit. Vespera sat, leaving a safe 2 feet of distance between them. You asked why I kept you, Malakai said quietly, staring at his hands. Why I didn't just lock you in a dungeon until the ink faded. He turned to her. For the first time, Vespera saw the exhaustion behind the gold eyes. For 200 years, my inner beast has been screaming. It's a constant, white-hot noise of rage. It's why they call me the Butcher. I kill because violence is the only thing that drowns out the noise. He reached out, taking her hand. He placed it on the tattoo. When you touch me, when you are near me, it stops. It's silent. It's the first peace I have known since I was crowned. He looked at her with a vulnerability that stole the air from her lungs. I am not keeping you for sex, Vespera, though I want that. I am keeping you because you are my sanity. If you leave, the noise comes back, and if the noise comes back, I will burn the world down. Vespera looked at the monster who was begging for peace. She sighed, dropping the toilet brush. Fine, she whispered. I'll stay. But I have conditions. Name them. 1, no biting unless I ask for it. 2, I get my own pillow. And 3, she grabbed a stack of pillows from the floor. We build a wall. This is Fort Vespera. You stay on your side, Your Majesty. Malakai looked at the pillow wall separating them. A small smile touched his lips. As you wish, my queen. But walls are meant to be breached.
Chapter 10. The Exploding Soup. Peace, as it turned out, was boring. Chaos was apparently Vespera's default setting. 2 days later, they were lunching on the balcony. Malakai was reviewing troop movements. Vespera was sketching new rune designs on a napkin. A servant placed a bowl of venison stew in front of the king. Vespera frowned. She sniffed the air. Her nose wrinkled. It wasn't the stew. It was the magical signature coming off it. It smelled like almonds and rotten magic. Poison. Malakai lifted the spoon to his lips. Don't! Vespera screamed. She didn't have time to explain. She didn't have a weapon. She had a quill and a pot of volatile blast ink. She grabbed the ink pot and threw it at the soup. Duck! Malakai, honing in on her panic, didn't ask questions. He threw himself backward, overturning his chair, just as the ink pot hit the hot soup. The reaction was instantaneous. The magical properties of the ink reacted with the heat and the poison. Boom! The soup didn't just splash, it exploded with the force of a small grenade. Venison, broth, and ceramic shrapnel blasted outward, coating the balcony, the windows, and the stunned servant in hot brown sludge. Silence followed. Malakai lay on the floor, covered in stew. Vespera was crouching under the table, holding her quill like a dagger. The servant, who was actually an assassin in disguise, wiped a carrot from his eye. He pulled a dagger. You little... Malakai moved. He was off the floor in a blur of motion. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He grabbed the assassin by the throat and slammed him over the balcony railing, holding him dangling 300 feet in the air. You tried to poison me, Malakai snarled, soup dripping from his nose, in front of my mate, during lunch? He dropped him. The scream faded quickly. Malakai turned to Vespera. He was covered in food. He looked ridiculous and terrifying. Vespera crawled out from under the table. I think the soup was bad. Malakai wiped his face. He looked at the crater where his lunch used to be. Then he looked at Vespera, who was trembling, clutching her quill. He walked over to her, picked her up, and kissed her hard on the mouth, tasting of venison and ink. "You," he growled against her lips, "are the most dangerous thing in this castle, and I am keeping you forever."
Chapter 11. The Shadow X. The soup incident had proven Vespera was dangerous, which oddly seemed to relax Malakai. However, it put the rest of the court on high alert. Vespera was no longer just the king's scandalous mistake. She was a variable, and in the court of Valhallow, variables were usually eliminated. 2 days after the assassination attempt, Vespera was in the Spire's lounge, attempting to teach a floating rune how to fetch a stick when the air temperature dropped 20 degrees. The shadows in the corners of the room elongated, detaching themselves from the walls and pooling in the center of the floor. From the darkness emerged Lady Nyx. The shadow fae looked immaculate in a gown spun from literal smoke. She didn't walk, she glided, and she was holding a small velvet-wrapped box. "I bring a peace offering," Nyx purred, her voice like velvet dragged over gravel. Malakai, who was sharpening a broadsword by the fire, didn't look up. "If it ticks, explodes, or breathes, take it back." "It is merely a gift for the new arrangement," Nyx said, her violet eyes sliding over Vespera with thinly veiled contempt. She placed the box on the table. "For the little scribe, a charm to mask her scent. It must be difficult for you, Malakai, smelling human all day. It's so cloying." Vespera bristled. "I smell like lavender and genius, thank you very much." Nyx ignored her, stepping closer to Malakai. She placed a pale hand on his bicep, her fingers lingering on the leather of his tunic. "Do you remember the winter solstice, Kai? The shadows we wove together? You didn't find my scent cloying then." Vespera felt a hot, ugly spike in her chest. It wasn't the rune, it was jealousy. Pure, green, acidic jealousy. This woman had history with him. She had touched him without needing a magical accident to permit it. "Remove your hand, Nyx," Malakai said calmly, finally looking up. His eyes were flat. "Or lose it." Nyx smiled, a sharp, dangerous thing. "You used to like my touch before you leashed yourself to a doodle." "She is not a doodle." Malakai stood, towering over the fae. The rune on his neck pulsed a warning red. "I am not leashed. I am anchored. There is a difference." He moved to Vespera's side, wrapping a heavy arm around her shoulders, pulling her into his heat. He looked at Nyx with boredom. "Vespera smells like life, Nyx. You, Nyx, have always smelt like a grave. Now, take your box and your shadows and leave. My mate and I have plans." Nyx's face twisted into a mask of fury, but she dissolved back into smoke, leaving only the scent of stagnant water behind. Vespera looked up at Malakai. "Plans? What plans?" Malakai looked down at her, his expression serious. "Teaching you how not to die. Grab your boots, scribe. We're going to the training ring." Chapter 12. Contact Sport. The royal training ring was a circle of packed earth surrounded by enchanted obsidian pillars. It smelled of sweat, blood, and ozone. "Hit me," Malakai commanded. He stood in the center of the ring, shirtless. His skin glistened with a light sheen of sweat, highlighting every scar and ridge of muscle. He looked like a god of war who had descended to Earth just to ruin Vespera's libido. "I don't want to hit you," Vespera protested, shifting her weight. She was wearing borrowed leather training gear that was tight in all the wrong places. "I'm a long-range fighter. I throw ink pots." "You threw soup," Malakai corrected. "And you got lucky. Next time the assassin might have a shield. You need to know how to defend yourself when I am not within reach." He stalked toward her. "Your center of gravity is low. Use it. Come at me." Vespera sighed. She lunged, aiming a half-hearted punch at his midsection.
Malakai didn't even block. He stepped inside her guard, hooked his leg behind hers, and swept her off her feet. The world spun. Vespera landed on her back in the dirt with a thud. The wind knocked out of her. Before she could wheeze, Malakai was on top of her, pinning her wrists above her head with one hand, his heavy thighs caging her hips. "Dead," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "You hesitated. Hesitation gets you killed." Vespera stared up at him. He was heavy, hot, and overwhelmingly masculine. The position was incredibly compromising. The rune on his neck was glowing, humming with the proximity. I wasn't ready," she gasped, her heart hammering. "Enemies don't wait for you to be ready," Malakai growled. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The lesson was forgotten. The air between them crackled with a different kind of tension. He shifted his weight, his hips grinding inadvertently against hers. Vespera let out a small, needy sound. Malakai froze. His pupils dilated, swallowing the gold. "Vespera," he warned, his voice rough. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you want me to finish what I started in the library." He released her wrists but didn't move off her. He traced the line of her jaw with a thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I am trying to teach you survival," he murmured, "but you make it very hard to focus on anything but devouring you." Vespera reached up, her ink-stained fingers brushing the hair at the nape of his neck. "Maybe survival is overrated." Malakai groaned. He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers, a tease, a promise, before he abruptly pulled away and stood up, offering her a hand. "Up," he commanded, his voice strained. "And this time, try not to seduce me. I have a kingdom to run." Chapter 13. The Ink's Memory. That night, Vespera couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from the training session had faded, replaced by a nagging thought. Why did the rune work? Soul inkers were notoriously difficult. They required intent, deep, profound intent. You couldn't just accidentally scribble one on a tyrant king unless a part of you meant it. She sat on the balcony, holding a glass of water, looking at the sleeping city. Malakai was asleep in the massive bed, tossing fitfully. Vespera walked back inside. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the tattoo. The ink was settled now, a permanent part of his skin. She reached out and touched it. Flashback. The memory hit her not like a dream, but like a physical transportation. She was back in the royal suite. It was the night of the festival. She was drunk, yes, swaying on her feet, holding a bottle of Moon-Mead. She had broken in on a dare expecting to find an empty room. Instead, she found the king. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He wasn't the terrifying butcher. He was shaking. The room was filled with a low, agonizing sound. A whine. It was his wolf, crying in the dark. Drunk Vespera didn't see a monster. She saw a man who was drowning in loneliness. "It's so loud," the king had whispered to the empty room, clutching his chest. "Make it stop." Vespera stumbled forward. She didn't attack him. She climbed onto the bed and knelt behind him. "I can fix it," she had slurred. "I know a spell for quiet." She had uncorked her special ink, the soul anchor. She hadn't used it to possess him. She used it because it was the strongest binding agent she had. She wanted to bind the piece to him. As she inked him, she poured every ounce of her drunken empathy into the needle. "Stay with me," she had thought. "You don't have to be alone. I'll stay." End flashback. Vespera yanked her hand back, gasping. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't an accident. She had heard his soul crying out for help, and she had tethered herself to him to save him from the silence. Malakai stopped tossing. He settled into a deep, peaceful sleep, his hand instinctively reaching out across the sheets until it found her leg. He held on even in his sleep. Vespera looked at him, her chest aching. "Oh," she whispered to the dark, "I think I'm in trouble." Chapter 14. Liquid Courage, again. The royal ball was mandatory. It is to celebrate the autumn equinox, Malakai explained as he fastened a diamond necklace around Vespera's throat, and to prove to the neighboring kingdoms that I haven't eaten you yet. Vespera stared at herself in the mirror. Her dress was gold, the exact shade of Malakai's eyes. It was backless, sleeveless, and clung to her like a second skin. "I look like a trophy," she mumbled. "You are a trophy." Malakai kissed her bare shoulder. "You are the only thing I have ever won that I didn't have to kill for." The ballroom was a sea of spinning colors and masked faces. The music was loud, the perfume cloying. Vespera hated it instantly. She felt the stares, judging, hungry, malicious. To cope, she found the punch bowl. "Careful," Malakai warned, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "We know what happens when you drink the good stuff." "I'm just taking the edge off," Vespera promised, downing a glass of fairy wine. "I am perfectly in control." 30 minutes later, Vespera was decidedly not in control. She was happy. Very happy. She was currently standing in the center of a circle of terrified dignitaries recounting the soup assassination with wild hand gestures. And then, boom, she mimicked an explosion. Venison everywhere. The king had a carrot in his hair. It was majestic. The dignitaries looked horrified. Malakai, watching from the sidelines, looked entertained. He walked over, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. "I believe," Malakai rumbled, wrapping an arm around her waist, "that my mate is embellishing." "I am not." Vespera leaned against him, giggling. "You looked cute with the carrot, very rustic." The crowd gasped. "You did not call the butcher cute." Malakai didn't growl. He smirked. He pulled her onto the dance floor. "Dance with me, Vespera, before you start another war." He spun her. For a big man, he moved with liquid grace. Vespera rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heart. The room faded away. The judging eyes vanished. It was just the heat of his hand on her back and the smell of sandalwood. "You're doing it again," Malakai whispered into her hair. "Doing what?" "Quieting the noise. When you look at me like that, the world goes silent." Vespera looked up, her eyes soft and glassy. "That's because I like you, Malakai, even if you are a grumpy, overgrown puppy." Malakai tightened his grip. "Careful, scribe. Keep looking at me like that, and we won't make it to the bedroom." Chapter 15. The Summit and the Single Bed. The diplomatic summit was held in the Iron Peaks, a neutral territory located on top of a frozen mountain range. It was cold, bone-deep, teeth-chattering cold. Malakai and Vespera arrived late, their carriage navigating the icy passes through a blizzard. When they reached the summit lodge, the innkeeper looked pale. "Your Majesty," the innkeeper bowed so low his nose touched the floor. "There has been a mistake." Malakai brushed snow from his fur-lined cloak. "What kind of mistake?" "The delegates from the Southern Isles brought their entire harems. We are overbooked. We have only one room left for the royal party, and it is the rustic suite." Vespera peered around Malakai's arm. "Define rustic." "The heating spell is broken, and there is only one bed. A small one." Malakai looked at the shivering innkeeper, then at Vespera, who was already turning blue in the draft. "Take us to the room," Malakai commanded, "and bring extra blankets. If my mate freezes, I burn this lodge down for warmth." The room was freezing. You could see your breath in the air. The bed was indeed small, barely a double. "Well," Vespera chattered, wrapping herself in 3 furs. "This is a classic romance novel trope. Only one bed, freezing cold. Next you'll tell me we have to share body heat for survival." Malakai stripped off his tunic, revealing his furnace-like chest. He kicked off his boots and climbed into the small bed. He lifted the covers. "Get in, Vespera." "I have blankets," she argued, though her teeth were clacking. "Blankets are insufficient. I run at 105 degrees. Get in." Vespera climbed in. The heat was instant. Malakai wrapped himself around her like a human blanket, pulling her back against his chest, tangling their legs together. It wasn't sexual, it was primal survival. "Better?" he mumbled into her neck. "Much." Vespera sighed, melting into him. They lay there in the dark, the wind howling outside. The intimacy was suffocating in the best way. "Vespera," Malakai whispered after a long silence. That night, when you marked me, you said something." Vespera stiffened. "I said a lot of things, mostly incoherent. You said, you don't have to be alone." Malakai's arm tightened around her waist. "Did you mean it?" Vespera turned in his arms, facing him in the dark. She couldn't see his eyes, but she could feel his breath on her face. "Yes," she whispered. "I meant it." Malakai didn't speak. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and tasted of snow and promise. It was the kind of kiss that started wars, or ended them. Just as Vespera's hand slid into his hair, deepening the kiss, the door to their room smashed open. "Attack!" a guard screamed. "Rogues in the perimeter!" Malakai roared, tearing himself away from her, shifting instantly into the protector. The moment was shattered, but the truth remained. The ink was permanent, but the feelings, those were becoming real. Chapter 16. The Vanishing Act. The kiss had been perfect. The interruption was catastrophic. "Rogues!" The scream echoed through the drafty corridors of the Summit Lodge. Malakai tore his mouth from Vespera, his golden eyes instantly shifting to the dilated black pupils of the beast. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his sword belt from the floor, strapping it on over his bare chest in one fluid motion. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in her bones. "Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. The rune will tell you if it's me." He kissed her forehead hard, a frantic, possessive press of lips, and then he was gone, throwing the door open and charging into the chaotic hallway with a roar that shook the snow from the roof. Vespera scrambled out of the warm bed, shivering instantly. She grabbed the heaviest candlestick she could find. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a survivor. She pushed a heavy oaken dresser in front of the door and waited. Outside, the sounds of battle raged. Clashing steel, inhuman snarls, and the screams of dying men. Then, silence. Vespera held her breath. A soft knock came at the window. She turned. The window was 3 stories up, overlooking a sheer drop into the frozen valley. Tap. 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 Vespera crept closer, clutching the candlestick. Through the frosted glass, she saw a face. It wasn't a rogue. It was a pale, handsome face, with a smile that had too many teeth. Lord Kalen, the vampire who had threatened to flay her in the throne room. "Hello, little inkpot," his voice muffled through the glass. Vespera backed away. "Malakai!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The glass shattered inward. Kalen didn't climb in, he misted in, reforming in the center of the room. He was faster than thought. Before Vespera could swing the candlestick, he backhanded her. The blow sent her flying across the room, crashing into the wall. Pain exploded in her head. The world spun. "The king is busy playing with my hired distractions," Kalen sneered, looming over her. "He left his precious anchor unguarded." Vespera tried to reach for her stylus to draw a defensive rune, but Kalen grabbed her wrist. He slapped a pair of heavy, iron cuffs onto her. Null iron. Her magic vanished instantly, sucked into the cold metal. "You marked what is not yours," Kalen hissed, lifting her effortlessly over his shoulder. "Now I'm going to peel that mark off your corpse and send it to him in a box." Vespera kicked and screamed, but the null iron drained her strength. As Kalen leapt out the window into the blizzard, the last thing Vespera felt was a searing, blinding pain in her chest, the bond stretching, screaming as she was torn away from her mate. Chapter 17.
The Butcher unleashed. Malakai decimated the rogues in under 3 minutes. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. He moved like a blur of violence, his blade painting the snow red. When the last rogue fell, gurgling in the snow, Malakai didn't sheath his sword. He froze. A pain hit him. It wasn't a wound. It was a tear in his soul. It started as a migraine, a spite of agony behind his eyes that blinded him. Then it traveled down, settling in his chest, a hollow, burning void where warmth used to be. Vespera. He turned and sprinted back to the lodge, taking the stairs 3 at a time. He kicked the door to their room open, shattering the lock and the dresser she had pushed against it. The room was empty. The window was shattered. Snow swirled in, covering a single spot of bright red blood on the floorboards. Malakai dropped to his knees. He touched the blood. It was hers. The noise came back. For weeks, the constant, screaming rage in his head had been silent. Now it returned with the force of a tidal wave. But it wasn't just rage anymore. It was panic. It was the primal terror of a wolf who had lost its mate. "Kaelin!" The roar ripped from his throat, shattering the remaining glass in the window. It wasn't a word. It was a verdict. His guards rushed in, winded and bloody. "Sire, the rogues were a diversion. I know," Malakai said. He stood up. His eyes were gone. No gold, no white, just an endless, abysmal black. His skin was flushing fever-bright as the bond sickness set in. The rune on his neck was burning, searing his flesh as it strained against the distance. "Get the horses," Malakai said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "And bring me my heavy armor." "Sire, where are we going?" the captain asked, trembling. Malakai walked to the window, looking out into the storm. He didn't need a tracker. He didn't need a scent. He could feel exactly where she was, because every step she was taken away from him felt like a hook ripping through his intestines. "We are going to the vampire estates, and we are going to kill everyone." Chapter 18. The Red Room. Vespera woke up to the smell of rust and old blood. She was chained to a stone wall in what looked like a dungeon, but fancier. There were velvet curtains, but they hid torture devices. Lord Kaelin sat in a chair opposite her, sharpening a very small, very curved knife. "You're awake," he smiled. "Good. The flaying works best when the subject is conscious. It keeps the skin pliable." Vespera tugged at the chains. The null iron cuffs were still on, leaving her magicless and weak. Her head throbbed. "He's going to kill you," Vespera rasped. "You know that, right? He's going to turn you into paste." "He will try," Kaelin shrugged, "but the bond weakens him. The further you are, the sicker he gets. By the time he finds my estate, he will be feverish, hallucinating, and easy to dispatch." He stood up and walked toward her. He reached out, tracing the line of her jugular with the cold tip of the knife. "I'm going to start with the neck," he mused. "Poetic justice." Vespera squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the cut. Boom. The wall behind Kaelin didn't just break, it evaporated. Stones, dust, and shrapnel exploded inward. Kaelin was thrown across the room, crashing into his collection of torture devices. Through the dust, a figure emerged. Malakai Vane looked like a demon dragged straight from the hells. He was covered in snow and blood. His skin was pale, sweat beading on his forehead from the bond sickness. But his presence filled the room with suffocating gravity. He held no sword. His claws were fully extended, dripping with the blood of the guards he had butchered on the way in. "Malakai!" screamed Vespera. Kaelin scrambled to his feet, his vampire speed kicking in. He hissed, baring fangs. "You look terrible, Your Majesty. Can you even stand?" Malakai didn't speak. He moved. He caught Kaelin mid-air. One hand grabbed the vampire's throat, the other grabbed his shoulder.
There was a sickening, wet tear sound. Malakai ripped the vampire's arm out of its socket and threw it across the room. Kaelin screamed, falling to the floor. Malakai put a heavy boot on Kaelin's chest. He leaned down, his face a mask of absolute, unfeeling violence. "You touched her," Malakai whispered. He didn't give Kaelin a chance to beg. He stomped. The sound of the rib cage shattering ended the conversation. Malakai stepped over the corpse. He walked to Vespera, his hands trembling. He ripped the chains out of the stone wall with brute strength, ignoring the keys. As soon as the iron cuffs fell away, Vespera threw herself into his arms. "You came," she sobbed. Malakai buried his face in her neck, inhaling frantically. I told you I would burn the world." Chapter 19. Blood and Bathwater. They didn't stay at the estate. Malakai burned it to the ground as they left. Back at the Spire of Bone, the atmosphere was heavy and quiet. Malakai sat Vespera on the edge of the massive bathtub. He had dismissed the servants. He wanted to do this himself. He knelt between her legs, dipping a soft cloth into warm, scented water. He was still in his armor, covered in grime, but his hands were agonizingly gentle as he cleaned the blood from her hairline, where Kaelin had struck her. "I failed," Malakai said, his voice rough. He wasn't looking at her. He was focused on a bruise on her wrist. "I left you alone. I let him take you." "You were fighting an army," Vespera said softly. She reached out, touching his cheek. He leaned into her palm, closing his eyes. The butcher was gone. Only the man remained. "The noise. When you were gone, it was so loud, Vespera. It wasn't just rage. It was fear. I have never been afraid before. Not until today." He looked up at her. His golden eyes were rimmed with red, exhausted and raw. "You are my weakness. And my only strength." Vespera looked at the powerful king kneeling before her, washing her feet. The intimacy was more overwhelming than the fear had been. "Then keep me close," she whispered. "Don't let go." Malakai stood up. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her easily. He stepped into the warm water with her, fully clothed in his trousers, not caring about the silk. He sat down, pulling her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Never," he vowed into her wet hair. "I will never let go." They sat there for an hour in the warm water, the steam rising around them. The spirit traced the rune on his neck. It felt warm, solid. But as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The edges of the rune. They were blurry.
Chapter 20. The Fading Ink. The panic set in 2 days later. They were in the royal gardens, supposedly safe. Malakai was reading reports, looking healthier now that the bond sickness had passed. Vespera was sketching, but her hand was shaking. She kept looking at his neck. The brilliant, glowing blue ink of the soul anchor was fading. It wasn't vibrant anymore. It looked like an old tattoo, gray and fuzzy at the edges. "The magic is dying," Vespera realized with a jolt of horror. The soul anchor, it wasn't permanent. It was fueled by the initial burst of intent, but it wasn't a true mating bond. "It's wearing off." "Vespera," Malakai's voice cut through her panic. He was watching her. "You've been staring at my neck for 10 minutes. Do you want to bite it?" He smirked, leaning back, exposing his throat invitingly. Vespera forced a laugh. "Maybe later." She stood up abruptly. I need to go to my studio, in the lower city. I need more supplies." Malakai frowned, sitting up. "I will send a gourd to fetch them." "No," Vespera said, too quickly. "I mean, I need to mix them myself. It's delicate. I'll be back in an hour."
She needed to find her old grimoires. She needed to find a way to renew the mark before it faded completely. If the mark faded, the bond broke. If the bond broke, the noise would come back. Malakai would go mad again. Or worse, he would realize he didn't actually love her, that it was just the spell all along. She turned to leave, but Malakai was suddenly there, blocking her path. "What is wrong?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Your heart rate is elevated. You smell of fear." "Nothing," Vespera lied. "Just PTSD from the kidnapping." Malakai reached out to touch her, but stopped. He looked at her eyes. Then he looked at the mirror on the garden wall. He saw the reflection of his own neck. He saw the fading ink. His face went deathly pale. "It's leaving," he whispered, touching the gray mark. "The magic, it's dying." He looked at Vespera, a look of utter betrayal dawning on his face. "You're going to the lower city. To get supplies? Or are you running away before the leash snaps?" "No, Malakai, You want to leave," he concluded, backing away from her. The shadows around him began to darken. "You were kidnapped, tortured because of me, and now the magic is fading, and you want to run." "I am trying to fix it," Vespera cried, reaching for him. "Don't," Malakai snarled, flinching away from her touch. "Don't touch me. If it's fading, then let it fade. Go, run, Vespera, before I decide to chain you here for real." He turned and walked away, the ice returning to his soul, leaving Vespera standing alone in the garden with the terrible realization that their time was running out. Chapter 21. The Silent Scream. Malakai Vane had returned to the darkness. He locked the doors to the Spire of Bone. He engaged the blood wards. He sat on his massive throne, staring at the empty air, waiting for the silence to end. And it did. As the ink on his neck faded to a pale gray shadow, the noise returned. It started as a whisper, a scratching at the back of his skull. Then it grew. The rage, the bloodlust, the paranoia. It was 1,000 voices screaming for violence. It was the Butcher returning home. He gripped the arms of his throne until the stone cracked under his fingers. "Let her go," he told himself, sweat beading on his forehead. It was the magic. It was never real. She stayed because the rune forced her. She cared because the bond manipulated her empathy. Now, the rune was dying. The leash was snapping. If she stayed, she would see him as he truly was, a monster losing his mind. He had to push her away. He had to be the villain one last time to save her from himself. A knock came at the heavy oak doors. "Malakai!" Vespera's voice was muffled by the thick wood and the magical wards. "Open the door! I have a plan! I can mix a new batch!" "Go away!" Malakai roared. The sound tore his throat. "The contract is void, Scribe. The ink is dead. Leave before I decide to hunt you for sport." He didn't mean it. Every word was a lie that tasted like ash. But he needed her to run. He needed her safe in the lower city, far away from the blast radius of his collapsing sanity. "I'm not leaving," she shouted back, pounding on the door. "You stubborn, dramatic, overgrown wolf! Open this door or I will blow it up!" "You can't," Malakai whispered to himself, closing his eyes against the pain splitting his skull. "I keyed the wards to my blood. Nothing gets in." He felt the last wisp of the soul anchor dissolve. The heat on his neck vanished. The silence broke completely. The noise screamed. Malakai fell from his throne, clutching his head, curled on the cold marble floor, alone in the dark once more. Chapter 22. The Break-In. Vespera stood outside the massive doors, panting. She had pounded until her fists were bruised. She could feel the magic of the door. It was an ancient blood ward, impenetrable, unbreakable. "Idiot," she hissed, wiping tears from her face. "He thinks he's saving me. He thinks I only loved him because of the ink." She looked at her satchel. She hadn't gone to the lower city to run away. She had gone to get her grandfather's reserve supplies, the illegal stuff. She pulled out a vial of void solvent and a jar of eternal ink made from the crushed scales of a star drake. "He locked the door," she muttered, looking around the hallway. But he forgot one thing. She was a Rune-Scribe. She didn't break walls, she rewrote them. She knelt on the floor and pulled out her heavy stylus. She didn't attack the door's wards. That would trigger a counterattack. Instead, she attacked the floor. She began to carve a transposition circle into the stone tiles. It was complex geometry, requiring perfect precision. Her hands shook, but she forced them to steady. "You want to push me away, Malakai?" She gritted out, the stone dust coating her hands. "Too bad. I'm clingy." She finished the circle. She poured the void solvent into the grooves. It sizzled, eating through the reality of the floor. "Bottoms up," she whispered. She stepped onto the circle. Gravity inverted. Vespera fell up. She phased through the ceiling of the hallway and erupted through the floor of the spire, landing in a heap on the white fur rug. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her ink jar. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. In the center of the room, Malakai was huddled on the floor, shaking violently. The air around him was thick with aggressive, uncontrolled magic. Furniture was floating and smashing into the walls. "Malakai!" She screamed over the noise of the magical storm. He looked up. His eyes were black voids. His fangs were fully extended. He looked feral. "How?" he roared, scrambling back from her. "I locked it. I set you free." "I don't want to be free," Vespera shouted, walking straight into the storm of flying furniture. A vase smashed near her head. She didn't flinch. "I want you." Chapter 23. The Siege of Shadows. Malakai stared at her. The noise in his head was deafening, screaming at him to attack, to kill, to destroy. But Vespera's voice cut through it like a bell. "Get out," he snarled, clutching his head. "I can't control it. The ink is gone, Vespera. There is no leash." "I never needed a leash," she said, stepping closer. "And neither do you." Before she could reach him, the warning bells of the citadel shattered the air. Clang, clang, clang. The balcony doors smashed inward. It wasn't wind, it was gargoyles. 3 massive, stone-skinned beasts, animated by dark magic, crashed into the room. They were siege constructs, remnants of the Void War, dormant for centuries. Someone had woken them. "The king is weak," a voice hissed from the balcony. It was a shadow mage, one of Nyx's loyalists seeking revenge. "The bond is broken. Kill the beast." The gargoyles lunged. Malakai was on his knees, crippled by the madness. He tried to stand, to summon his strength, but his coordination was gone. A stone fist backhanded him, sending the Lycan king flying across the room into a pillar. He crumpled, blood pouring from his temple. "No!" Vespera screamed. The gargoyle turned its glowing green eyes toward her. It raised a massive stone claw. Vespera didn't run. She didn't hide. She grabbed her jar of eternal ink. She threw the jar at Malakai. It smashed against his chest, splattering glittering black liquid over his heart. "Malakai!" she screamed, diving under the gargoyle's swing. "Use it! Channel it!" She pulled out her stylus and slashed the air. She wasn't drawing on skin, she was drawing on the air itself, connecting the spilled ink on Malakai's chest to the ambient magic of the room. Rune of awakening, rune of wrath. The ink on Malakai's chest began to glow. It wasn't the soft blue of the soul bond, it was a violent, burning red. Malakai gasped. The magic didn't quiet the noise, it focused it. It took the screaming rage and honed it into a weapon. He opened his eyes. They were gold again. Burning, furious gold. Chapter 24. Back to Back.
Malakai moved so fast he blurred. He caught the gargoyle's fist mid-swing, inches from Vespera's face. The stone crumbled under his grip. "You touched her," Malakai growled. It was the voice of the king, not the madman. He ripped the gargoyle's arm off and used it to bludgeon the creature into gravel. The other two constructs charged. "Vespera, get behind me," Malakai commanded. "No," Vespera yelled, scrambling up. She dipped her fingers into the spilled ink on the floor. She slapped her hand against Malakai's back as he spun. She drew a quick shield ward on his skin. A golden barrier erupted around him just as the second gargoyle breathed a stream of fire. The fire washed over them harmlessly. "Nice trick," Malakai grunted, grabbing the second gargoyle by the throat. "I aim to please," Vespera yelled, ducking a flying stone. They fought. It wasn't the elegant dance of the ballroom. It was a brutal, chaotic brawl. Malakai was the hammer, destroying everything in his path with brute strength and claws. Vespera was the scalpel, slapping explosive runes onto enemy limbs and shielding Malakai's blind spots. They moved in perfect sync. He anticipated her movements, she anticipated his rage. Malakai tore the head off the last gargoyle and threw it off the balcony, crushing the shadow mage below. Silence fell over the room. The furniture was destroyed. The walls were cracked. Malakai stood in the center of the wreckage, chest heaving, covered in stone dust and black ink. He turned to Vespera. The red glow of the combat runes faded. The ink on his chest dried. He looked at her. He waited for the noise to return. He waited for the madness. It didn't come. His head was quiet. He looked at his neck. The old tattoo was completely gone. The skin was bare. There was no magic binding them. And yet, looking at Vespera, disheveled, holding a stylus like a dagger, fierce and terrifyingly beautiful, he felt the most profound peace he had ever known. "The noise," Malakai whispered, walking toward her. "It's gone." "I know," Vespera said, dropping her stylus. Her hands were shaking. "But the ink is gone," he said, touching his bare neck. "Why is it quiet?" Vespera smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Because you aren't alone anymore, Malakai. The noise was just your wolf screaming for a pack. I am your pack." Chapter 25. The Permanent Mark. 3 hours later, the spire was cleaned. Mostly. Malakai sat on the edge of the bed. Vespera sat behind him. The atmosphere was heavy, but not with fear, with intent. "Are you sure?" Vespera asked softly. She held her stylus. This wasn't a drunken needle. This was the ceremonial tool of a master scribe. "I have never been more sure of anything," Malakai said. He dipped his head, exposing the bare skin of his neck. "Mark me, Vespera, properly this time." Vespera dipped the needle into the eternal ink. She didn't draw a possession rune. She didn't draw a leash. She began to work. The needle broke the skin. Malakai didn't flinch. He leaned into the pain, grounding himself in her touch. It took an hour. When she was finished, she wiped the blood and excess ink away. She handed him a mirror. Malakai looked. It wasn't a name. It was a complex, interlocking design of two wolves, one made of shadow, one made of light, circling each other to form an infinity knot. It was the rune of equals, the ancient symbol for true mates. "It binds us," Vespera whispered, resting her chin on his shoulder. "But it doesn't control us. You can leave whenever you want." Malakai put the mirror down. He turned and pulled her into his lap, burying his face in her neck. "I am never leaving," he vowed. "I am the king, but you—" He kissed the spot behind her ear. "You are the ink in my veins. You are the silence in my head." He laid her back on the bed. "Now," he growled,
his golden eyes darkening with a very different kind of hunger. "I believe we have a marriage to consummate. Sober, this time." Vespera laughed, pulling him down. "Shut up and kiss me, my king." And for the first time in 200 years, the king of Valhalla obeyed without question.